This is an important panel. It seems to me it's in a sense what the Left Forum is about, organizing and doing something about what we forum about during these 2 or 3 days. And this is a complicated panel to organize because we have 8 people on it, and we have 4 topics, and we have an engaged audience, and we want to let everybody have a chance to speak. I've done the mathematics. We have 8 people, 2 minutes each introducing, 2 minutes each talking on each of 4 topics times 8 people, and it all comes out that we will have a half an hour left at the end if we all are disciplined in what we say. We want to talk about 4 different issues in organizing, and I'll outline them briefly and then go over to the panel. The first one has to do with space. It follows a little bit some of the other discussions that were already taking place at the forum, and it comes out of an article that Fran Piven wrote in The Nation that got a good bit of attention, that one of the problems with organizing now is that in the old days when organizing was, left organizing was mainly an issue of industrial worker organizing, people were together in factories. Now they're not together on a lot of the issues that we organize around issues of mortgage foreclosure. People have single-family homes. Unemployed are not together except perhaps on employment lines. Rent control issues, a lot of housing issues. People are not together in one place physically. Is that a problem? It will be a problem that some of our speakers will want to mention about, and for others it may not be. The second question is the question of compromise. In any organizing campaign, there's always a question of what's the goal and to what extent are you willing to compromise to get to it. And I don't know if there are general rules for that, but there are problems that are faced in common about who decides when to compromise. And that's a question that we may want to address. The third question is coalition building. Who ought we to be in coalition with, and who are allies, and who are simply supporters, and who are opponents? What kind of coalitions do we want to build on? What kinds of principles do we want to build them? And the fourth question that comes up now more and more is the scale of the solutions that we seek, which are so often more than local. How do you deal with balancing the issues that are national or even global with the issues that are strictly local? People have limited time, limited energy. How do you divide your activities? So those are the 4 topics. We have very competent and experienced people who have thought about these things. I will ask them each to briefly identify themselves and to say a word about what their organizations do, maybe 2 minutes each. And then my hope is that we can stick to one topic at a time and go around first the question of space, secondly the question of compromise, thirdly the question of coalitions, and fourthly the question of scale, and do a round among us on each of those, and then open it up for discussion to everyone amongst ourselves and amongst you on each of them. So we don't have enough chairs to get our whole panel in front, so people will have to come up and talk, but let's do that. Why don't we start with those that aren't already sitting? You want to start?
We want to go right down the list.
Oh, okay, we could do that. Yes, okay, we start out with Monica Adams, who will
Who comes from Wisconsin? You gotta say more.
You all flatter us entirely too much. My name is Monica Adams, and right now I'm here representing Take Back the Land Madison as a local action group, and also Take Back the Land movement nationally. And really what the movement is about, it's about gaining community control over land through direct action, which we talk about as positive action, but a lot of you may know it as civil disobedience, essentially nonviolence, civil disobedience. And we strive to have community control over land and to elevate housing as a human right. And what that work looks like specifically in Madison, we identify properties that are owned by bailed out banks that received a lot of federal bailout money. So for example, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, banks like that, we look for properties owned by them and we liberate them, which is essentially we put people in homes where there are no people. That's kind of the gist of the work. To be
Thanks. Michael Kane.
My name is Michael Kane. I'm an organizer based in Boston with the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, and also I work locally as an organizer with the Mass Alliance of HUD Tenants. We're a tenant union of tenant groups in privately owned HUD subsidized housing. It's a sector of housing. It's not public housing. It's privately owned buildings, but they all have in common HUD subsidies. And there's a perpetual crisis because of that contradiction of owners trying to get out, convert to market rate. Our organization is structured as a union. I'm an organizer. Our board leader, Lynne Crawford, couldn't make it today. She's laid up in the hospital. It's the only national tenant union at this point in the United States since 1992. There's an elected board of directors from groups. They represent groups, they're not individual members from around the country. I have a conference in Washington and a network of local organizing coalitions or organizing projects in different cities that share resources and coordinate by conference calls every 2 weeks. So we'll talk later about some of our recent campaigns.
Eric? Eric Crawford.
Good morning. My name is Eric Crawford. I'm a resident of public housing, as well as a resident association president representing the largest public housing here in the country, New York City. And for the last 13 years, I have had the opportunity of organizing residents of public housing in order to secure, preserve what we have, which is the only form of low-income housing. Had the opportunity of working with other organizations, both locally, Community Voices Heard, national organizations like Right to the City, and many others, NPA, and we have been working hard to preserve what we know is our homes, and it is a hard fight. As Michael alluded to, the differences between public housing, multifamily, Section 8 houses, there's a difference, and we need to know those differences because it's important. Our hope is that we be able to preserve that we have lived in for me all of my life thus far, and that is public housing. And hopefully with this forum, this network will start where we can find common goals, what we can do to bridge the gap that exists amongst us all, and hopefully preserve what we all need, and that is low-income housing. Thank you.
Mark Crawford.
George. As much as I love Eric, but not married yet. my era. I told you, Rob. They trying to marry me off. Eric, we're just dating right now. So I'm old George. I'm from Community Voices Heard, CVH. And just to give you a brief background around CVH, Community Voices Heard, we're about 15 years old. We were started by 3 women of color on welfare who decided that they were no longer interested in hearing what other people felt about women on public assistance, and that since they were actually directly affected by the issues, that they should be defining those issues. So as a result, they started CVH. We're a member-led organization, and what we mean by that is that our members actually decide the campaigns we work on, the issues we work on, and are the decision-making body. Us as staff just really help to facilitate and make those happen. If you've seen us a lot lately, we've been in, all over Albany, getting arrested, doing this, going to people's house, because that's what my members want to do. and I specifically had the public housing campaign. I'm a former public housing resident, and some of the issues that we'll get into those later, but currently we're working around issues of repairs. NYCHA has, New York City Housing Authority has a backlog of 3 years of repairs. They've decided to work around some stuff on the federal level with the budget, and I think the last one is they're introducing, that it's building a lot of momentum, is called participatory budgeting, where actually the people decide and participate in the budget process. Ooh, what a cutting concept. So those are briefly what the campaign is working on. And
well, could you just name a couple of coalitions that Community Voices heard as a part of?
I think it'll probably be easy to name the ones we're not on. But we're part of Rights to the City, National People's Alliance, Pushback Network, Grassroots Global Justice. Ooh, oh my goodness. Yeah, Housing Justice Movement. Actually, my title has actually changed. I'm no longer the director. I'm actually the partnership director, because my campaign alone, public housing campaign, is involved with 6 major coalitions, as we'll talk about later. And that work alone is such a chunk of the work that we actually had to create a separate position.
Thank you. Mo George. Kendall Jackson.
Good afternoon. I'm Kendall Jackson, and I'm from Picture Homeless, and I'm a housing campaign leader, among other things. Picture Homeless is a grassroots organization founded by the late Lewis Higgins Jr. and Anthony Williams in November of 1999 in response to then Mayor Giuliani's bullying of the homeless population. We are and will always be led by homeless and formerly homeless people. Our current housing campaign began in 2006 when the organization, along with Manhattan Borough President Scott Springer, conducted a count of vacant apartments in the borough. We found over 29,000 vacancies, which would have housed the homeless shelter population in its entirety of that year. From this, we drafted legislation called Annual Census of Vacant Buildings or Lots, known as Intro 48 in the City Council. Simply, it would change the city charter and mandate an annual count of all vacant properties. We feel this is the first step towards real affordable housing in New York City. Starting in this April, actually April 5th, we, in collaboration with Hunter College and the public, will do the count ourselves. We will write the methodology for future counts and prove to the city can be done with little experience. We also have a civil rights committee, and we're working on disorderly conduct, because police have targeted the homeless population and to continuously issue disorderly conduct tickets to them. We're involved with Petra and a few other movements at this moment also. But basically, I spend my time working on the initial 48. Thank you.
Thank you. Big Bob.
Good morning, I'm Vic Bach. I do housing policy advocacy work with the Community Service Society, which is an anti-poverty organization based here in New York City. For the last 15 years, much of my work has been with public housing resident leaders here in New York City and at the Washington level on policies that affect public housing communities. It stems from the period when Congressman Rick Blasio was reigning over public housing reform, and we got our act together here in New York City. And ever since then, I've been working with some of the people on the panel and others on coalition building and gaining a voice for public housing residents. Thanks.
And finally, Rob Robinson, who is really responsible for putting this panel together.
Thank you, Peter. That's very kind of you. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Robinson. I work with a policy and research group here in Manhattan called NESRI, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. Does work around human rights issues, in particularly 4 areas: the human right to education, the human right to work with dignity, the human right to housing and the human right to health care. My focus, basically, being formerly homeless, is in the housing area, and I serve as a special advisor to NESRI's campaign to restore national housing rights. I don't want to, I kind of misquoted that. I shouldn't say NESRI's campaign, because it is a campaign of some grassroots organizations from around the country. One of them is here in the house today. Kendall Jackman is here representing Picture the Homeless, whom I was with when we joined the campaign to restore national housing rights. Frank Syndico from the Northeast Pennsylvania Organizing Center. Mayday New Orleans, which is represented by Sam Jackson and some folks doing some great work. You may have seen a NESRI-produced film called Coming Home. Sam Jackson is featured in that film, and it features the folks in New Orleans fight to get back into public housing post-Katrina. Becky Dennison and a great group that I started working with about 3 years ago, LA Can and the Los Angeles Community Action Network. And finally, a young brother who I want to say turned his life around, but was always passionate about his neighborhood. He's from Chicago. Public housing resident. He lived in Cabrini Green, one of the largest public housing complexes in the country, and very passionate about what the government did to public housing. But this young man I've watched change and grow into a national leader, Mr. J.R. Fleming in the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign. So those are some 5 very strong groups. I'm very happy to be a representative and a special advisor to this group. We'll talk about a lot of the work that they've done lately and some of the work that we've done in the past. Much of the literature of that campaign in NESRI is on the back tables, but we'll have a deeper conversation as the panel processes.
And I'm Peter Marcuse. I teach at Columbia in the urban planning program, and my field is housing, and I'm teaching a course on mortgage foreclosures at the moment and what can be done positively about turning them into a basis of extracting some occupied housing from the housing market and making it nonprofit, making it community-based, community land trust, mutual housing associations, whether that might be an answer to the mortgage foreclosure crisis. And so that's who we are. Who are all of you? How many of you would consider yourselves primarily organizers? How many of you would consider yourselves engaged activists in groups that organize? Okay, so that's a significant number. And academics? A minority. Good. Is there any other general category?
How about other people who live in, how about first we ask how many people live in subsidized housing, and then we find out how many people get the interest deduction on their mortgages. But then we could ask how many people live in public housing.
Very good. Okay. Public housing? Subsidized housing?
Does that include the mortgage
I was about to say to the extent that you don't get a deduction for mortgage interest. So subsidized housing, owner-occupied housing,
and rent stabilized.
And the rest are renters. Renters. Okay, it's New York. Okay. Okay, let us then go around maybe in the same order, and we don't have enough chairs, unfortunately, but rather than have you have your back, I don't know if you want to come stand, or there's one more chair at least. The first question that we wanted to get addressed, and it may not be a significant issue for you, and if so, don't feel obliged to comment on it, but is this question of where you get people together, and does the fact that these are now urban and city-related issues to a large extent, does that play a role, or do you just take life as it is? How do you deal with that issue?
So I think in order for me to adequately address the issue of space, I want to, one, give you a couple principles of the Take Back the Land movement itself. One is that it is a movement to gain community control over land, and I'll be very clear about that. It isn't a movement to hopefully get a reform in some sort of policy, or no, it's very clearly a movement to have community control over land. Two, we do so by direct action, or what we call positive action. So we use nonviolent civil disobedience tactics to liberate these spaces. And folks who are a part of the movement must agree that this is how you're going to do so, this is how you're going to achieve gaining community control over land. And three, that the movement must be centered around those who are most affected. And it tends to be low-income women, folks of color, genderqueer folks of color as well. Now, I want you all to envision, and I want to contextualize what that would look like in a place like Madison. Madison often gets talked about or touted as a very progressive place, but Madison is about 88% white, about 6% black, and then I apologize, but I don't know the exact numbers of other folks of color percentage-wise, but I know it's about 6% black and 88% white. And how do these kind of radical missions or visions and values play out in a context like that? Well, Madison has a huge disparities in terms of achievement gaps, disproportionate minority confinement. So it's more or less known that Madison has a salient race problem. So now when we think about space, we think about space in three types of ways. We think about it as like in cultural space, political space, and physical space. So what does it look like for a group that is fairly small in numbers, who is hyper-policed, to take space, essentially, to take political space and build a movement and say, hey, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to take over our land, or we're going to take back the land, right? And what does it look like for a group of people who are disenfranchised to take up the cultural space that's also necessary to be able to do something like that? And then three, what is the physical space that you'll take back, right? So if we think about, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Madison, but in Madison, folks of color live in different pockets throughout the city in low-income housing, right? And Take Back the Land, we are trying to take back houses that that the banks that were bailed out, I don't think they technically own them, but whatever, that own them. And so when we think about space in terms of where folks are located, we're essentially taking a group of people who have been forced in different areas throughout their experience in Madison due to gentrification and so on and so forth. And we are essentially taking back space, or taking land in spaces that are white politically, that are where white people live, and that have very white culture in those spaces. So it's very conflicting for us to be able to do that, and it's very, very challenging to be able to do that work. And so what that means for us in terms of space is not only do we have to identify physical spaces that we think we can win, but also spaces that are affirming, because what is also very problematic for us in this movement is how do we choose a place where the family will be safe, for example, or how do we choose a place that people do want to call home, essentially. So I think the question for space for us happens, like I said, in both a physical, cultural, and a political way. And it's a very complex question, and I know I'm talking very kind of abstractly about it, but these are things that we have to continuously grapple with in order to build a strategy for a movement that people who are very small in numbers and who are hyper-policed and who are very disenfranchised can win. So,
I suppose in terms of housing issues, one can sharpen the question of space by asking, is the work that you do building-based, neighborhood-based, or community-based, as one way of focusing? Okay, Michael, do you want to cover?
Well, to answer Peter's question, the work that we do is building-based. Every building is different. There's a subsidy structure that is usually putting people at risk of losing their homes. And so our mission is to make sure that doesn't happen and to get improvements. But there's typically a culture of fear and harassment by private landlords and management agents who don't want people to organize at the building level, because they can make a lot of money if people, they think they can make more money if people are not organized. Typically there's no organization at all. Most people have no clue that they could be out on the street if their subsidy contracts are ended in the near future. So it typically takes, not always, but it usually takes some outside organizing group with the capacity to know about those things and the capacity to go in and help people form a group in the building level. And our practice is to organize democratic organizations, tenant unions at the building level that are democratic, meet regularly, representative of all the diversity in the buildings. It's a very diverse community, racially, ethnically, mostly women. Most households are led by women in HUD housing. And to try to overcome those divisions, build unity at the building level, and most importantly, groups that are independent of the owners and management agents, and that's usually a struggle. People then form alliances at the city, usually in a city level or a neighborhood level, but we learned early on that you can't get very far in saving HUD housing, privately owned HUD housing, unless you deal with HUD. And you can't do it at the city level because the people in Washington make the decisions. So the people that were doing this work in the 80s, the tenant leaders who were doing that work in the 80s realized that to get somewhere they had to form a national union. It was the tenant leaders that came together in Washington who formed NAT in the late 80s, early 90s, and said that we needed to have a voice for ourselves in Washington, that we can't leave it up to advocates, well-intentioned advocates or agencies, that we need to do it ourselves. We need to have our own voices heard. So NAT was built as at the national level as a union with tenant groups as the members, sending delegates who then elect a board based on HUD regions. So it's a combination of building level organizing, it's a building block, but with area-wide coalitions that have some resources to do organizing and can cover multiple buildings in the area, like a Central Labor Council, and then a national union with a board that goes to Washington 3 or 4 times a year and meets by conference call much more frequently to make decisions and set direction. Is that, should probably stop there. Okay, good.
So for CVH, we actually do both. So because specifically for public housing, and the fact that we're our members are residents of public housing and developments all across this city, from as far out as Far Rockaway, Staten Island. We have members from either from all over. So we do a combination of both. So there is community and there's buildings. Just to lend you the scope of what public housing in New York City looks like, there are 180,000 apartments, and it houses, officially on record, 4,630 something, 400,600. But actually on record, that's on record. But actually, more realistically, we calculated at about maybe half. Is it 500,000 or 550 now? Maybe. Somewhere around that number, because folks, due to income and other family reasons, have doubled up into apartments. So for us, it is really about, and when I say us, I say myself and Eric, it's really about getting into the buildings and actually talking to folks. Eric is a tenants association president, so we at CVH, we work really well, and a lot of our members are part of the tenants association structure. And we try to actually come together to find solutions, because at the base of it all, everybody is trying to preserve New York City housing in the city, and public housing specifically in New York, as we look at the fact that we are more and more switching to a have and have not system, and affordable housing in New York is a dying breed. So when you really look at the housing authority here, we really have to really go into the buildings. We're in there talking to folks. We just did we're actually in the process of finishing up a actual survey in the housing authorities, where we surveyed about 5,000 people to get a sense of some of the actual issues. So for us, it's actually in the buildings talking to folks and actually bringing folks out to you know, whatever action that we're doing, if we decide to do a press conference or, you know, a rally or, you know, a civil disobedience, you know, whatever members have decided that they want to do to push forward, is how we really figure out how the base is. Like, you know, it's in the building, so we're in the buildings. You know what I mean? So, and it's in public housing, so we're talking to folks in public housing, in their building across this city, you know, irregardless of what folks say about various projects. That's where we need to be. That's where my members are talking to folks, and that's where staff is as well.
Eric?
My question would go back to the concern of how do I organize people when there are so many other issues that individuals face outside of their home and public housing. Is my space inviting for other people to be able to join part in? For instance, is I'm separated because I'm gay and you're straight, but I live in public housing, but I don't want you in a meeting because we have people that make slurs towards someone that's gay. Or somebody that is just different in color or race, they believe in something. Do I make fun of that person so they don't feel they are invited in my space to be able to build, capacity build, to be able to address the issue that we all have in our building? So it's hard because in public housing, I can be frank to say residents are distracted with their own individual things. They believe change is not possible. Yeah, my roof been leaking forever. I've been complaining forever, so why should I come to this meeting and organize with you to go and fight Washington when I can't get my manager to come here with a hammer and a screwdriver just to put up something for me? So the point is coming to understand that there's a bigger issue that we must address. In order to address the bigger issues, then we can worry about the small things. And what I want them to understand, I don't mean that your apartment issue is small, but there's something larger. We don't have money into public housing. We need money so that we can address your issue. You've been waiting on a paint job. You've been waiting on that toilet to be fixed. But if we don't come together to fight Washington so that we can get the money we need to address those issues, then we'll be in the same place. So I believe that organizing and building capacity and getting people involved means more than just saying, come and fight with me on this issue. It's about maintaining interest. It's about making sure my space is inviting. So whoever you are, rather you're gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual, queer, those different names that I'm still learning, you should be feeling invited in my space so we can build together on those issues. And I believe once we start doing that, we'll have a better place and a better effective place to build towards that social change and social movement.
I vote that.
That'll overlap a good bit with the coalition discussion that we're coming to. Okay, Kendall?
We deal with the homeless population, and one of our main ways of organizing is outreach. As a population, we share soup kitchens, pantries, shelters, trains, train stations, parks. So one-on-one talking, word of mouth is our best way to engage each other. Our organization, we try to do outreach at certain soup kitchens. I live in a shelter. I try to get the women in my shelter to wake up and come to meetings. As Eric said, you have to have a space that's inviting. Well, picture the homeless, we have computers. Folks who are out on the street, we have a place where they can take a shower, we have a kitchen so you can get something to eat. So we try to make it like a home that we don't have at the moment. We also use computers. We have a membership list. Our lead organizer is sitting in the back of the room. Sam sends out blurbs to everybody. Our office manager does the same thing. Recently, we partnered with Councilwoman Annabelle Palmer, who's the chair of the General Welfare Committee of the City Council that oversees DHS and HRA. And I literally took my telephone, my emails, and my Facebook and got in touch with nearly 70 women I knew in the shelter system to try to get them to come out. So even though our population is scattered and our main focus is on outreach because that's the best way to reach them, we have moved into a somewhat technical age because, as Lynn said, folks think homeless people don't have phones. Well, a lot do, a lot don't. You'd be surprised how many of my friends are on Facebook and are living in the shelter. So we use both methods to get to the people we need to get to. But like Eric said, having a comfortable space, somebody feels welcomed in when they come, is what makes them come to you again. We had one gentleman come last week, excuse me, to our housing meeting from an outreach they did that Monday. He came in, we had snacks at our meeting, he was able to get a sandwich, something to drink, he was welcomed. We talked to him about his problem, and he's going to be back. So besides reaching out, you have to have some place that you're going to stay, come to, and be a part of.
It's interesting. If you read the popular press, you would think one of the major issues in organizing now is the use of the internet as an alternative to the use of space. Proximity is a method of organizing. It's interesting to picture the homeless should be the first mention of the internet. Okay, Victor.
Given a base in New York City, and as Mo indicated, 500,000, a subsidy of public housing residents here, it's amazing that there is no clear or strong voice for public housing residents in the city other than a few organizations like CVH, people like Eric, who speak up. And that's despite a wonderful set of HUD regulations. They're called 964 regulations that give public housing tenants the right to organize and in some sense kind of right to collectively bargain with the housing authority over any and all policy issues. Yet, for a subsidy of 500,000, there is no voice. Part of my job is trying to keep that subsidy informed. So twice a year we have public housing forums to which we invite resident leaders to come and find out about emerging ongoing policy issues like Petra, to deal with Section 3 training and employment opportunities, and a host of things, but that's clearly not enough. I'll also add that in the sort of mental map I have, the picture is one of fragmentation rather than solidarity, and it's fragmentation on several fronts. A lot of our most active CBOs and advocates for public housing, like myself, are also active in the Washington front. So we have a number of groups working in Washington, and I find that the links to the resident constituency they claim to represent is unclear. How does that communication take place rather than those of us that do the lobbying, how do we know we're representing the residents that we want to? Secondly, I think there's fragmentation between the activist, professional activist left and the academic left. And I think some of that is no clearer than it was under the debate about Petra, for those of you who know about Petra, and we can talk more about that. But I think there has not been the coming together I would like to see between academics on the left and policy activists on the left who are trying to work out long-term strategies to preserve public housing and have to deal with maybe the compromises Peter wants to talk about.
That issue may be one in which the left forum can particularly play a role on this bringing together of people with different backgrounds, different stakes, different interests. Okay, Ron?
Thank you, Peter. So I'm going to, I didn't want to go here, but I'm going to beg to differ with Vic a little bit, because the reason Peter is moderating this panel is the fact that I brought to his attention that we need help from the academic left in making change and getting our issues out there. So Peter wrote a very interesting article in the Planners magazine. Tom Ngati, an urban planner at Hunter, has seemed to come to our side. I don't have to talk about David Harvey and Neil Smith. The academics are out there. Jackie Levitt on the East Coast, on the West Coast. So the academic community is rising up. Some of it is the activists' fault for not reaching out and thinking that, they have this concept that all the academics do is spew theory at you. Well, I'm going to beg to differ, because they have embraced the work that I do at a great level. They have embraced the work that this campaign to restore national housing rights does. at an incredible level, and I know I can always turn to them for support. And we're looked at different as a campaign because of that fact. It was very easy for us to put together an anti-Petra letter and get people to sign on because that list of academics was huge, high level, and important. And then the signatures started to flow once the folks saw those academics. But I think I want to get back to the space, and this is not, I don't want this to sound like I'm wrestling with Vic or differing, but I think some of those changes are starting to happen. And I think we have to work at it as activists a little bit harder. But I want to go back to the individual organizations within the campaign. You heard Kendall speak about Picture the Homeless, so I don't have to reiterate that, but I think the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign has a concept that's unique. You know, we're going to defend people that are living in public housing. You're not going to foreclose and put them out on the street. We're going to come with our folks from the streets of Chicago, and Big Henry, about 400 pounds, leading the crew, saying, put us out with our 100 people standing here to defend this property. It's not going to happen. It's a radical approach. But they, at the same time that they use those radical approaches, they also go into the courtrooms. When somebody's about to be foreclosed on in the courtroom, they bring 100 members into that courtroom. And you know what? All of a sudden, the judge is looking at a case different. There's community support like he's never seen before. You know, when the case is over, 100 people rise up, the courtroom empties, and decisions are starting to go in the favor of that Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign. So they're finding ways. The ways are a little bit different than we're accustomed to. The Los Angeles Community Action Network is big. You know, they don't do a lot of work in public housing, but they're starting to see public housing being torn down in LA and disappearing quickly, so they're starting to step it up. But they work with a collective on the West Coast called the Western Regional Advocacy Project, doing some big work on housing. The Los Angeles Housing Collective, individually, including LA Can, doing dynamite work to keep people in their homes, to prevent foreclosure, to do anti-eviction work. Mayday New Orleans, a lot of their work revolves around public housing. You heard me talk about the film Coming Home. A lot of their fight focuses on an individual building, as Peter alluded to. The Iberville projects down in is one of the last large complexes standing in New Orleans, and that's where the fight is located right now, to keep that public housing, to keep it out of private hands. So those fights continue, and it's always a struggle for space. It's a combination. It's also getting the residents involved. As Eric said, that's a challenge. People have a lot on their plates already. You know, forget the other social issues. It's every day. I don't have a job, man. I don't have a job. I need a job, you know? So all of these things come into play. So I think one thing, and it'll come out when we talk a little bit about coalitions, the one thing that's important about this campaign is it's a group of organizations and individuals within those organizations and memberships that have a large level of trust. And that trust allows us, it allows none of those other members from Chicago who couldn't be here today, Mayday, New Orleans couldn't be here today, Northeast Pennsylvania Organizer Center couldn't be here today, but they said, Rob, we know you'll speak on our behalf, so we trust you, what you're going to say, you know our work. And that's what this is. This is a group that trusts one another. We'd like to grow and make it a little bit bigger, but you'll hear about that when we talk about coalition work.
What Rob is saying is, in a sense, a transition to the next question that we wanted to raise, the question of compromise, and maybe one way of making that a concrete question is this. A lot of the work that we do, most of the work that we do is controversial and gets us involved in conflict and in negotiations. And in the negotiating end of organizing, who makes decisions as to what to ask for and when to compromise? And does that also involve the question of, do you at some point then turn it over to the experts? What's the decision-making process that resolves issues of negotiation at the end of organizing? Why don't we go through everybody, if you want to pass on the question till we get to coalitions, which also involves the question, fine. But Monica?
I think the issue of compromise is a large issue that we struggle with, tactically and also theoretically. And so, for example, there are questions of, given the context of Madison, there are questions of, how do you talk about the issue? How do you frame the issue in such a way that's palpable to a larger community? Should we compromise? Should we not be so outright in saying it's about community control over land. It's about those most affected. Essentially, it's about Black people also. Like, should we be very forward and, I guess, and aggressive in that language and putting that out there? So there's compromise, right, in terms of language and messaging, right? But then there's also questions of tactical compromise. And I think locally, Take Back the Land Madison, also nationally, we're very clear that our tactics do not compromise. So we don't ever say, okay, we're not going to do direct action anymore. We never say, okay, we'll stop engaging in positive action on any level. So we're very clear about that. But what's been playing out in Madison is, I'll give you an example. One of the homes that we liberated had a mother, a Black mother, and 3 children in a predominantly white neighborhood, and half the street were white middle-class homeowners, and the other half were renters. And a lot of the those houses that were by the renters were being foreclosed on. So you have essentially one side of the street of very established homeowners, and then another side of people moving in and out. And there was some issues that happened the year prior with some folks of color. So this neighborhood had a lot of tension, but nonetheless, we chose the home, and the family liberated the house. The families moved into the house, they stayed there, and we had to do a kind of a defense to be able to allow the family to stay in the house. And because we got so much pressure around the house and so much pressure in the media around what was happening, then came the question of compromise. We started getting phone calls from folks. We started getting phone calls from people like the mayor, other housing folks, Progressive Dane, which is a political party in Madison, and other folks who have decision-making power essentially within institutions started giving us phone calls and saying, okay, we're ready to talk, we're ready to compromise. And for us, we were like, wait a minute, I think we won. We could have won something, but we're not clear about what the next level was. Should we compromise? Should Take Back the Land Madison sit down in a negotiation session with the mayor? And we said no, right? I think something that makes Take Back the Land so powerful is how radical it is, and is about how clear it is that alternatives are what need to happen, and existing institutions, including governments, do not work. So Take Back the Land Madison didn't sit down and have that meeting with the mayor. And that draws into the coalition question, which is going to come up next. That's why it's important for us to be able to have strategic partners who can engage in that type of work, because we're very clear that as a movement that shouldn't be our primary role, to necessarily sit down and talk policy or reform with legislators. So I think the question of compromise is a larger question, and something that we struggle with both locally and both nationally, in terms of essentially, if you win, what is the win? How do you win it? What are you willing to take? What are you willing to accept and say, okay, this is a victory? Or do we say, no, we don't, we're not going to take anything you give because we're going to take everything ourselves? So I think it's a larger question that we struggle with, and we're still working essentially to come up with a perfect solution and to be able to develop models of that. But in terms of who decides what is the win, our base in Madison are street homeless folks. So they're very much at the center of anything that we do. If they say we want this property, or if they say we're not going to leave, or if they say this is getting too risky with this property, we're going to leave, then they're the ones who decide. We believe in building a movement of the people, for the people, so the people essentially who are most affected are able to decide what it is that they want to engage in, and the allies, whether it be other folks of color who are not homeless, or white allies, follow the leadership of those folks. So that's how decision-making happens in the complex question of compromise.
In an early panel this morning, David Harvey commented that if the right wing were strategically deciding where to pick a fight, Madison would be the wrong place.
Exactly.
Okay, Michael.
Okay, well, in terms of who decides to compromise, if there's a struggle at a building level to save that particular building, it has to be the tenants who live in the building. So the key is to build a group that can make those decisions at the building level. That is not easy. It can take years to do that, usually because of the harassment that comes from the owners and management companies. But if people can overcome that challenge, then a variety of tactics, obvious tactics, press strategies, negotiations, getting elected officials involved, litigation if the owner screwed up in some way and there's a legal handle, Sometimes you can get, sometimes a group, because there's a national tenant union, they can go through NAT to Washington to get changes in policies at HUD or even legislation passed that adds to the number of handles that they can use at the building level to save their homes. In Boston, we added it up recently. We've saved 11,400 apartments, one building at a time, through tenant organizing strategies over 27 years. 50, 60 different struggles, and every one of them was different, every one was unique, but the decisions were always made by the leaders in the building, by the groups in the buildings through a democratic process. At the national level, because we have the advantage, we're a democratic organization with a board that's elected from a membership every year. The board comes to Washington, meets on a regular basis by conference call, goes to Washington 3 or 4 times a year. And this has been going on continually now for 18 years, so there is a structure there. The organization is larger. There are what we call associate members who don't have voting rights. Those are the organizing projects or coalitions at the local level. They might be a tenant coalition or an organizing project. In New York, it's Tenants and Neighbors. You have PAC in Brooklyn, Greater Syracuse Tenant Network. So those are the groups now in New York. And they participate by a conference call system every 2 weeks. It's not the internet, but you send things out by the internet. But the conference call system actually was a big leap forward to be able to organize. This didn't happen. You couldn't do this until the 80s. To be able to organize at a regional level or beyond to link buildings in the city or across the country. So the organizing projects, the organizers, the leaders from different parts of the country brainstorm in conference calls and sometimes committees to come up with policy recommendations. They get funneled through the network to the board of directors of the group that sets the policy. So if there's right now we're facing a legislative, I see Ricky Leung here, who's a former board member and a leader in the Lower East Side, works with Goals. Goals is another group that we work closely with in New York City. Ricky testified in Washington three times now before the House Financial Services Committee. So we're trying to get national regulations. We've lost 400,000 apartments in the last 15 years because of owners getting out of the system, converting to market. That's a loss of housing. 400,000 apartments lost forever as affordable housing. So we're trying to fight that by getting back a regulatory framework that limits owners' decisions to do that, to regulate them. They fight that fiercely in Washington. So we had a bill that proposed a regulatory framework. Barney Frank was willing to introduce it. The owners marched in and said, if you don't take that out, we're going to kill the bill, the overall bill. So Barney took it out. We had to face the decision, well, what do we do? Do we oppose the bill? Do we try to get it strengthened? We took a strategy of trying to get it strengthened. We lost. Now we're facing a decision. The bill is about to be introduced by Schumer in the Senate. Comprehensive preservation was like 200 pages with 40 different provisions. All of them are important. All of them came out of tenant struggles, a lot of them here in New York City, to formulate ways to save this housing stock, to keep it in the social ownership or social subsidized system for affordable housing. But we may have to sacrifice even the watered down regulatory provision. We're facing that decision right now. And we have to get back to, we're going to have to meet with Schumer's office around that. So that's an example. But that decision will be ultimately made by our board of directors coming together in Washington next weekend. And in consultation with the associate members who don't have voting rights. It's a distinction. The organizers are welcome to participate in decisions, but they don't have any voting rights. I have no voting right. I'm an organizer. So everything gets channeled through a structure so that it's accountable to the members. The members are the tenant groups at the building level that elect that board. I think it's the only, in the housing, probably the only organization structured like that in the housing sector right now. So, and it's worked. I have to say it's worked pretty well for 18 years too. And we've won a lot of things at the national level from that process.
Interesting analogy there with the labor movement, where the role of organizers within the movement was very often a controversial one, and where union members objected to organizers taking policy positions. Okay, Eric.
I'm going to speak only for New York City, because that's the only place I have experience in. I think public housing residents have compromised too much. Every issue, the resident compromise. Rather, it's the public housing authority that decides that we're going to attach some crazy service fees to your apartment repairs, or we're going to increase your rents because we need more money. The residents of public housing here in New York compromise. I believe we need to come up with something similar to the concept of the Tea Party movement. Not saying I endorse them, but we need a crazy type of movement in public housing. We might need to do what is being done overseas. Make a stand for something and stay with that stand until you get what you want. Public housing residents in New York City have not and does not do that. Vic earlier mentioned about the fact of leadership. There's a structure that exists here in New York City for resident organizations. I'm, as a resident association president on the local level, have a leadership on the district level. The district level have a leadership on the citywide level. But guess what? None of those levels do a damn thing for public housing residents here in New York City. That's the problem. When I have to go and fight for myself, when I have someone that stands up and say, I represent 500,000 residents of public housing, but you're busy having your head up the chairman's ass, what are you doing for me? When I can't seem to get my repairs done in my apartment, and every day I pick up the phone and I call that crazy number that I get an extraordinary date next year when my roof is falling down this year and you're telling me 2013 is my appointment, that's a problem. But guess what? Residents compromise because they don't do anything. They feel, well, I pay my rent. I work. I'm not on welfare. That's a lot of residents' public housing favorite spot. I'm not on welfare, and you still have the mess that you've been living with for years. My mother been a public housing resident for 40 years. I've been here 33, which is all my life thus far and counting. And the only way I can get something done is not to compromise with the housing authority. If you go across the street to 250 Broadway and mention Eric Crawford, they'll know just who Eric Crawford is. That's that young black man that come in here with a do-rag on his head and his cap to the side that will stay in my office all day until he gets what he wants. That's not compromising. When my residents need heat, and when I first became TA president back in '98, we didn't have heat for years. We used to stand around, cut the stove on, put the big old quilt or savana around us, stand up in the stove trying to get warm. And I got tired of that. So I said, I'm going to make it my business every day to go. At that time, Reuben Franco was the chairman of the New York City Housing Authority. I made it my business, got dressed, put on that favorite do-rag and cap to the side, no weapons. And I went down to 250 Broadway. I went up to the 12th floor, and they said, who are you here to see? I'm here to see the chairman of the Housing Authority. Well, do you have an appointment? No, I don't have an appointment. Well, how may we help you? I need heat in my apartment. Well, the chairman can't see you today. You got to make a schedule. Tell him that Eric Crawford is going to sit here until he comes. 5 o'clock came. I'm still there. I left, came back the next morning, 9 o'clock in the morning. After 4 days, he got tired of me sitting in his office, waiting on him to come, that he came and met with me. And my residents not just got heat, got a whole new boiler system, because I refused to compromise what we need in public housing. So when we can get residents in public housing to wake up, to say you're paying your rent to live comfortably, safe, and decent. Until they stand up and make some type of movement to move forward in this world, to preserve what is theirs, we're going to continue to compromise. But I refuse to compromise. And with coalitions that we're going to talk about later, understanding capacity and building capacity to make a movement, public housing residents will, at that time, will stop the compromise. So hopefully one day, public housing residents here in the city of New York will stop compromising.
Sure, we'll come back to some of these issues.
I have to go after Eric. So Eric is the epitome of CVH members. He's a CVH member, and like I said earlier, that the campaign is member-led and the organization is member-led. So there is no word of compromise. That's like cursing at them. When I go in a meeting and say, well, let's compromise, they're looking at me like, you're going to step outside, that's our compromise, and we're going to organize this, and you come back when you stop cursing at us. So for them, you know, they feel that they have. You know, if you get an appointment, like Eric stated, if you call to get your bathroom fixed, you have a leak, and you get an appointment, which right now, currently, if you call for 2013 and you pay your rent, that's a compromise. Because no other landlord, and just to be clear, New York City Housing Authority is the largest landlord in New York City, gets away with what the Housing Authority gets away with. I live in private housing now. I spent 42 years in public housing. My landlord tells me that they're not fixing my bathroom. I'm telling him you're not seeing no money until my bathroom is finished. Housing Authority residents, Public Housing Authority residents in New York City don't have that option. So they have compromised. So my members who are public housing residents such as Eric come to us and they say to me, Mo, we're not compromising. Either he's going to come or we're going to follow you around. Case in point, the current chairman did not want to set a date to meet with residents of New York City. He feels that he just has to meet with the official resident structure. Residents said, no, we want you to come and meet with us. He decided not to come. My members went to his board hearing and held their base signs in the board meeting saying we want a date. And when he didn't, they followed him to his office. And the next stop would have been his home. So they don't compromise because they feel like, I don't have to. I've done that enough and it has gotten me anywhere, nowhere. It's 75 years of public housing here in New York City and still the buildings are decaying. People can't get repairs. But every month, if I'm late, you have somebody knocking on my door saying, well, where's your rent at? Well, where's my toilet at? Or where, you know, we have people in public housing who are living without stoves. You know, Eric worked on an issue last year with the public housing development in Manhattan where people were eating on hot plates for 6 months. 6 months. But yet, every month, the housing authority expects their money. But yet you give me a hot plate that started fires, that have shorts, and I'm supposed to feed my family in the dead of winter off the hot plate. That's their compromise. They're not doing it. So I stand proudly with my members to say, we're not compromising in this city. This is our city. This is our housing authority. We have this right. We pay our rent, even if we don't pay our rent, which most of the time folks think that, you know, they're in public housing and folks don't. The majority of people in public housing are working. 76% of public housing residents in this city work every day. 76%. So that's a whole lot of money coming into the housing authority. So they don't have to compromise because there's no compromise made on the other side when they think about what they need to do or what they want to cut or just the various other things that they think about when they think about what's going to happen in public housing in this city. Public housing in New York has 19 waterfront properties. 19. And I can't even tell you how in demand they are. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Prime example. But those, you know, they're not going to be a part of the compromise that is currently going on with the housing authority to sell off their parking lots. To put up, matter of fact, we saw a proposal the other day where they want to put up luxury housing. You know, so those are the type of things that they want to do, but they don't come to the residents to speak about it. It isn't because like Vic and other advocacy groups and other organizing groups in this city have said, you know what, this is not going to happen. We're not compromising. We're going to force you to do exactly what you are supposed to do. So, you know, again, that word for my members is a curse.
Pretty clear answer. Kendall?
Well, being homeless in New York City and living in a shelter, in my opinion, being homeless in this city is a compromise. I have a curfew, I'm told I can do my laundry, etc., etc. I've only been with Picture Homeless 8 months, and as I said when I started, the current campaign, housing campaign started in 2006.
Could you talk a little louder? We can't hear you.
Well, the current housing campaign, Picture the Homeless, annual census of buildings and lots started in 2006 when they wrote the initial legislation. And unfortunately, from that moment on, compromise was the city's key word. And in my opinion, like I said, I've only been with the organization 8 months. Based on what they started with, the city has whittled it down to just making it count, which is fine. Bloomberg claims we don't have any vacant properties. It's not a problem. Doing the count will prove that he's lying and that we have more than enough property in the city to house the entire homeless population you know of and that you don't know of and take care of lower income. But the organization got tired of being nice and compromising. So last year we started what our afternoon panel calls increasingly boisterous direct action. Like Eric, we had a PTH Most Wanted poster in 250 Broadway. When they saw certain members come through the door, we were immediately escorted back out of the door because they didn't want to deal with us. We've closed down housing meetings, we've closed down city council, we've sat in front of Eric Dulan's office, who's the housing chair, quote unquote. We've got into fights with the sponsor, Melissa Martin-Burrito, because she wasn't doing her job. As I said, in my opinion, unfortunately, we had to compromise the last 4 years. But we reached a point where compromise isn't working. When you have buildings that have been warehoused for 40 years, and you find out one of the biggest banks in the city that got a bailout 2 years ago, now 3 years ago, has been sitting on that building this whole time and claiming, oh, there's no property, waiting for another developer to come along and take it, you get tired of compromise. So, as I said in the beginning, we had to compromise, but we reached a point where you can't compromise anymore. We're dealing with a mayor, like Mo said before, that is a rich man who doesn't understand the middle class. He definitely doesn't understand the poor. And when you find out that the quote-unquote advantage program to help you get an apartment for the city homeless went bust on Monday, and now they're talking about, instead of putting money into that program, acquiring more property to put more people in shelters, he doesn't understand the people he's supposed to be representing. So at Picture the Homeless, like I said, we got tired of compromise. We have gentlemen like our distinguished moderator, Dr. Tom Gotti at Hunter College, who understand what we're about, who have brought that academic esteem to what we're fighting for, and we just got tired. We had a meeting with a caucus, and the chair of the caucus tried to explain to us the process of the bill. And then he looked at us, he said, I guess being homeless every day is one day too long. So it finally clicked. You can sit there and say, it's going to take 4 or 5 years to get the bill passed, but be patient. When you're sleeping on a train, you can't be patient. When you're sleeping in a shelter and they're telling you to go get a job and there are no jobs out there, you can't be patient. So, as Mo said, compromise has become a dirty word in Picture the Homeless. And I don't think we're going to use it anytime soon.
It would be nice if you believe everything our panelists are saying. If we never compromise, we'll always win. The trouble is we don't always win, and sometimes you have to decide what to do when you're not likely to win. But anyway, Victor.
I think I'd rather talk about negotiating rather than compromising. We don't think of collective bargaining as compromising. But the thing that I'm concerned about is whether or not, in order to negotiate effectively, you have to have a certain degree of solidarity. You cannot, in a very plural field with multiple actors, really negotiate from a position of strength. And Rob mistook my comment before about fragmentation on the national scene as a criticism of the academic left. What I was observing was fragmentation rather than solidarity. We have a number of, in New York City itself, we have a number of local organizations and advocates representing residents. A number of them are here, key organizations that I work with. But we had to start a roundtable that meets monthly in order to keep track of what each of us was doing, and in order to find a way to, and an opportunity to support each other mutually in our separate efforts. I think the Petra example in Washington is a classic example of fragmentation on a national level. I think those of us on the left saw organizations, national organizations, competing, backbiting, strong-arming each other. The academic left taking a very visible position, the eminent George Lakoff on the Huffington Post, without any kind of connection with the larger group that was trying to negotiate with HUD, who I think the Obama HUD had a serious and genuine intention to find a long-term strategy to preserve public housing. Now that's my view, and I think that's what HUD intended, and I think that because we split, we may have lost the opportunity we would have had. That's where I am. Thank you.
That's going to clearly open up the question of coalition building that we'll come to in just a minute. Rob?
So, personally, the word compromise turns my stomach. I'm part of Take Back the Land, and I don't have to speak about Take Back the Land today. Monica is doing a great job. Max Rameau, who everybody knows is my mentor, is in the house. And Take Back the Land Rochester is here. Don't believe in compromise. And if you haven't been following the email change this week, they successfully defended a house up in Rochester. So, I ain't a part of any compromise anyway. All right? I'll tell you that straight out. But the Campaign to Restore National Housing Rights is a group of grassroots organizations that took a stance early on against Petra. It's a national coalition that said, we are against Petra. And we've had conversations with academics. We've had conversations with HUD. We've had conversations with some of those groups that are at a level where they have access to policymakers at a high level, and we've told them we're against Petra, and you can play a middle of the road, or you can play gatekeeper, allowing access to those elected officials, but we will find a way to get our point across, and we have stood our ground. The Campaign to Restore National Housing Rights has come out against Petra, remains against Petra, remains against Keith Ellison's bill, which is revitalizing, restoring housing, or whatever he's calling it these days, which is Petra handed off to Keith Ellison to submit to Congress. We are still against it. We find it troublesome when you take public goods and put it into private hands, and that's what Petra and that bill stand to do. So we stay officially on record as being against it. That being said, it doesn't mean that I don't agree with some of the things that Eric has said, well, maybe not Eric, I think Mo was the one that said that public housing residents can't do a thing about it. I think we can. I think okay. All right, well, maybe I misunderstood you, but let me just go on record as saying if public housing residents are fed up enough and stop paying their rent and stop paying it for 6 months, I bet you a whole lot of shit will change in this this city, because there's a certain amount of money that's going into NYCHA's pocket, into HUD's pocket, that's going to ring a bell. When you hit a capitalist in the pocket, they wake up, man. They wake the hell up. So I think if you had tenants come together in New York City and around the country at a national level and say we're going on a rent strike, a whole lot of things will change. So I think compromise. There are times when you do have to negotiate. But compromise, no, we don't have to compromise, all right? These are our buildings. These are our cities. Our government took it upon itself to take our tax money and bail out the banks, and said that basically said it's okay for you to fail. So to me, that was the time that we should have gotten up and raised some hell. So Monica, I'm going to give Madison all the credit in the world, because Madison finally said, you know what, we're tired of the shit. New York, I ask you, when are you going to say you're tired of the shit? Because you are the city that's 8 million strong, right? You're supposed to be setting the tone of the nation, and everybody knows I challenge the city constantly. Vic is right. You know what? We are a fractured movement, because everybody has their own little silos and their own little campaigns, and they say, this is what I'm about, this is what I'm doing. What the hell are we doing? That's what has to happen. Cornell said it great last night, if you were at that opening plenary. you have to take a look back at history. You have to embrace history. You have to embrace the present, and you have to embrace the future. We have to bring it all together. For me, that's why I learned not to compromise, because as a member of Picture the Homeless, when we took over that property on 116th Street, and the young lord started calling me on the phone and saying, I want to talk to you, and people like Mickey Melendez, who was running Thompson's campaign, would call me to the side and say, I want to tell you something. I don't want you to make the mistakes I did. Don't compromise. Don't say no. You people are right in what you're doing. You have to stick to your guns. So compromise isn't a part of the vocabulary I use on a regular basis. I don't think it's a part of J.R. Fleming's language. I don't think it's a part of Becky Dennison's language. Frank Syndico is learning a little bit, but I can tell you that boy's radical up in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. It's not a part of his language either. He's tired of it. People are fed up. And I can tell you Sam Jackson has had it up to here down in New Orleans. So compromise ain't part of the campaign to restore national housing rights. So I'll just leave it at that.
In the interest of time, I'm going to combine the last two questions. And let me give a brief link to them. This morning, at one of the discussions, the organizer for the Domestic Workers Union recounted how they got the first legislation in the nation passed that gave collective bargaining rights to domestic workers and put them under the protection of wage and hour law. And she said, in the fight for that, they needed to get domestic workers together. It was around the question of space. How do you get people that work in very different places together? And they were able to do it because they linked with first the Service Employees Workers Union, SEIU, with the doorman. And the doorman linked them to the domestic workers in their buildings because they knew them all. So that raises one part of the question, the coalition building. They had not sort of theoretically thought through with whom could they work on this campaign. It hit them in the face, and when they went to the doorman said, "Where have you been all this time?" They were looking for it. But it was not as a result of an affirmative outreach to build a coalition. It was thrust on them. And very often coalitions form simply about people that volunteer or groups that volunteer to come together. But there isn't a strategy of coalition building. So that's one of the questions that her story relates. The other is that they got the legislation passed because they were able to use the service workers union lobbyists to do the negotiating for them in Albany. And the question of what's the relationship between the organizing and the lobbying, or the organizing and the negotiating, and where is the line between negotiating and compromising, is a tricky line. And I'm interested in how you all see that. Okay, let's start with
do I build, or do I try to build, or even invest energy in trying to transform, essentially, a system of nonprofit organizations? Do I put energy into trying to transform a system of folks and organizations that have traditionally hurt and have oppressed our communities? And so far, the answer for us has been in a lot of ways no. But that doesn't mean we don't need strategic partners. So it is a battle in trying to find who those people would be, specifically when it comes down to us winning, right? If the bank calls us tomorrow and says, Monica, we'll give you these 5 houses, we're tired of you, what do I do with the houses? I'm very clear, I'm not a landlord, right? I don't necessarily have the answers to developing what that land relation would look like, considering that capitalism still exists, right? So I think in that sense we do, like Rob was saying, we do need support of academics. So it's about finding those who can be allies, who are left and radical, who can help us build or give us models for that new infrastructure that we're seeking to build. It's also about finding folks who know a lot about direct action, who could give us legal support or legal help, who are willing to develop creative defenses because we're getting arrested, right? So in that sense, we are looking for coalitions of folks, but in terms of a lot of the local groups that are in Madison, we don't necessarily have coalitions with them. And I think kind of broader for the movement, I think the same thing is true. I think we're clear that we need strategic partners who are who have legal background, who are legally savvy, and also academic folks to help us kind of work out what some of this new society land relationships would look like, different things like that. But there are lots of organizations who do housing work that we don't necessarily build partnerships with or coalitions with because they're not, in my opinion, simply put, they're not radical, and we're not interested in compromise, as the previous question. And quickly about the scale of solutions, Take Back the Land is a movement to address root causes, and land space, ownership is often at the root of many things like capitalism and so on and so forth, right to exist, other things like that. And so though the movement is happening locally in all different places, Rochester, Miami, Madison, and other places, the scales or the implications of what the movement is aiming to achieve is definitely national and international, quite honestly. It's really about changing the way the entire world, or the capitalist world, is dealing with land and land relations, essentially. So the scale is much bigger than us local folks in Madison.
Good. Yeah, maybe it would be helpful in terms of definitions, never mind Bill Clinton. In terms of definitions, if we made the distinction between a coalition and an alliance, I'm not sure technically that always works, but that the right to the city is a coalition that can be in alliance with groups that are not members of the coalition, and where do you draw the line between the two? How does that work itself out? Michael is part of an alliance.
Actually, I was just thinking it's a coalition. NAD itself is a coalition of groups. It's a coalition of groups. But this last December, we realized that the new Tea Party Congress was about to slash the HUD budget and a lot of other budgets affecting poor and working people. And our board decided that we weren't going to wait for it to happen, that we needed to get out front before it happened and on the streets in as many cities as we could. And we issued a call to action, not just for our members, but for at the national level, we wanted to join forces with other national groups. And at the local level, we encouraged our local affiliates to reach out and form coalitions with public housing, voucher tenants if they were organized or had any networks from like the RAB or whatever in their cities, homeless organizations, neighborhood groups, veterans groups, anybody they could to come together and challenge particularly Republican, but not, as we've realized, you have to hit the Democrats too. Don't assume that the Democrats are not going to vote for budget cuts. And we went out, we decided to pick a target date that everybody could grab onto, Valentine's Day, have a heart, save our homes. And we're out, we managed to pull off in about 3 weeks actions in 17 cities. And it rolled on afterwards for a couple of more weeks. We issued right before the Senate was going to take their straw poll a week ago, we issued a press release telling them to do the right thing and vote for the Senate appropriations bill, which fully funded public housing, veterans programs, and so on. And just to give this clarity, in public housing, they're talking about a $1.6 billion cut. We're out opposing Petra. It's going to take 20 to 30 billion to just save the public housing stock that's there now. If buildings are going to fall down if they don't get that infusion of cash. There was $2.5 billion in last year's budget. So that's not enough right there. Well, the Republicans are talking about cutting it by 1.6 billion, cutting that fund by 1.6 billion. So that's what's going on in Washington. They're cutting 1.4 billion from the voucher system, which includes 10,000 vouchers for homeless veterans. Think about that for a minute. The Republicans want to cut vouchers for veterans who are disabled and living in shelters because they're disabled from fighting imperialist wars. Why should people fight their wars if that's how they're going to be treated? We have to get that message out in every city that we can and challenge this. So we started doing that. In Chicago, 300 people. JR was part of that coalition in Chicago with the anti-eviction campaign, and the Chicago Housing Initiative led the effort. They shut down traffic. 11 people were arrested in front of Senator Kirk's office a couple of weeks ago. They were out again 2 days ago with another 30 people at Kirk's office. The Republican senator just got elected to try to position him. In Boston, we had 150 people march on Scott Brown's office. In San Francisco, they didn't have any Republicans, but they went ahead with a couple of hundred people and blocked the entrance to the federal building. So we did in Houma, Louisiana. There were 80 people, elderly people and high school kids. And they were holding signs along the highway to get Senator Vitter to do something. You know, we put it out there. People could do what they could. Some people were just voucher tenants in the middle of, rural Florida who went to their congressman's office in Sacramento, some cities in rural California. Voucher tenants got little petitions together and went down to their congressman and challenged him. You have a congressman here in Staten Island. No one's challenging. No one's, as far as I know, nobody's going to shut his office down. I don't even know.
Michael Grimm.
Grimm.
Aptly named.
He is Grimm. He's a Tea Party, right? So we have to hold these people accountable and day after day until people get the message that they need to be thrown out of office. Otherwise, we're in trouble. This is going to go on for another 10 years. Okay, Obama's already announced a freeze for 5 years. So the cuts are very deep, and we need to have a coalition not only of housing groups, but we figured what we could pull off would be coalitions of housing groups around the HUD budget. But I don't see any other constituencies out there on the streets, unfortunately. But we need to figure out ways to get other groups mobilized in education and health, job programs, job training programs. Everything's being cut by the Tea Party Congress. So we have to form broader coalitions in the streets outside of while lobbying at the same time, and challenge these people, hold them accountable, and throw them out of office if they don't vote to protect budgets, vote to tax the rich, end the mortgage interest deduction. There's a lot of other ways. We're talking to Scott Brown's office. And he said, "Well, what else do you propose to cut?" We said, "Well, cut the war budget. Eisenhower tax rates would eliminate the deficit. I'm an Eisenhower Republican. There's a lot of other solutions to this crisis besides cutting programs that affect people, poor people, and working people. So that's one coalition that we started. We're going to continue it as long as it takes, and we need to form other types of coalitions. But we have to have an alternative for public housing. Maybe we get a discussion going about the Petra and that, because the dilemma is if we don't build enough support to get more money added to the budget in this climate, we're going to lose the housing stock. And Donovan's argument is he's taking a different line, that by forming a coalition with the capitalist institutions, that'll bring in more capital to save the stock. Right? That's the challenge. And we haven't come up with an alternative to that.
One of the issues on which there's clearly a difference of opinions on.
Right. Well, he's saying,
in the interest of time, I'm going to try to go quickly through the rest and then open it up. But I want to give you all the chance to Eric.
I guess it goes back to who can I trust in my movement or my building movement. My base is going to be those that I know will be there for the long haul. That's the people that have the same concept that I may have, or we share some common goals. My alliances are going to be those that I can use to get to my common goal. I don't expect, for instance, me and Vic worked on getting a meeting for New York City together to educate residents on public housing. Now Rick works CSS. I don't expect Vic to endorse some of the crazy stuff I do. I don't think I'm going to conform to everything Vic believes in. But we came together to work on that common goal, and that is to get the people of New York City into a room so HUD can educate them and they can ask questions on what the issues are regarding Petra. We accomplished that. I did not have to worry about whether Vic believes in everything I believe in, but we had this concept in mind that we're going to get the residents together, let them get educated, let them ask questions, and have a free, open area for them to air out their concerns regarding Petra. Now, if I sit down in a room and decide that someone have to be 100% like I think, I don't believe I'm going to have any alliances or coalitions building. So I think the movement needs to be a little more, being more conservative as to what other people are going to do. Can you help me reach this goal? Yes, I could. Well, this is what I'm about. Can you think you can work with that? Yeah, I can work with that. Well, what are you about? Let me see if I can work with that. Because we just got to get together for the common goal. I don't need you to come all the way with me because I have my base that's going to go with me all the way. My base is the residents that live in public housing. Those that will be affected by every issue that I talk about every day, rather it's the maintenance issue, the working issue, the need for jobs, for more housing. When you get that focus point in mind and keep in mind that you don't need no one for the long haul because you have your base for your long haul, then you'll stop interviewing people for the coalition work. Because you don't need to interview no one to be part of a coalition or an alliance. I know what you're about, I just need you to help me get here. That's my concept. I don't believe I need to be everything like you. I don't believe you have to believe and be as radical as I am. But I do need to know that I can trust you to get to this point. And when I get to this point, nice working with you. If I need you again, here's my business card, let me take yours. Let me move on with the fight. That's all I'm going to say on that. Mo?
I feel like you tagged me in. So, I think for CBH and for my members, they are part of, I just told you earlier that I'm now the partnership director. So they're probably a part of too many coalitions and alliances, and to tell you the truth, enough to keep me working for 10 days straight. So, but I think what they did when they decided the ones that they are a part of is a lot attached to what Eric said. They had to decide which ones will get them where they need to be. Because they know at the heart of them, at the heart of what they do, they don't want to compromise. But they're not against sitting on a coalition like the Housing Justice Movement and talking about what Petra, and for those that I know we've talked about that a lot, and we should probably define that for folks, is in legislation. I'm sorry, just so folks know, because y'all know y'all been hearing it. But anyway, it stands for Preserving, Enhancement, and Transformation of Rental Assistance, and it's a federal program to basically privatize and Section 8 all of public housing across this country. So so the Housing Justice Movement is one of the coalitions that my members sit on, and in that coalition, they first stated, up front that they were not interested in that bill. But it is not at all uncommon to have people who live in public housing, let's make that straight, decide that they should talk about the bill, and they should see what negotiations they can make in their favor, because as much as we say no to it, there is no active campaign going on now to say how are we going to put the $30 billion that public housing needs in this country back into the budget. What it is just a continual starving of public housing across this country. And so my member said, well, yeah, it's easy to say no to it, but we also want to see what it is we can negotiate, because we feel like if we don't, no money is going to come into public housing, because that's not the topic of conversation. So as a part of a lot of the coalition and alliances and just get-togethers, because some of them feel like get-totogethers more than actual coalitions or alliances or whatever you want to call them, they've decided to start that conversation. And I totally agree with Vic when he said negotiations, because that's what it is. And that's what they talk about in them when they're talking about how should public housing look. And in a lot of them, they talk about how can we get that $30 billion to preserve public housing across this country. Because there are a lot of folks saying no, but we really need folks to say no and. No to Petra, and this is exactly what we need to make sure that public housing is preserved, you know, across this country. So a part of those alliance and coalitions are exactly, you know, what those conversations are. But if you ask them alone as standalone when we have our campaign meetings, you know, their actual politics is radically different from a lot of the coalitions that they stand and sit on and participate in. And I think, like I said, I think they do it because it may have some, you know, strategic alliance or to them at the time. But at the heart of it, if they could, they probably wouldn't sit on any. And I may be out of a job. But I think that they have assessed the ones that they on and how can they help them win exactly what they need, and at the base of that is making sure public housing is
I assume that we can, technically, we ought to be out of here now. I assume we can stay 15 more minutes?
No compromises, staying for 15 minutes.
I know Picture Homeless has a small core group of people who show up every day and work with the limited staff we have, and we stretch ourselves as thin as we can. I know we do belong to Right to the City, and taking what Mo said about the politics of each individual organization, granted they may not agree on everything, but there is a common goal. For instance, when I can, and my schedule's been crazy lately, I go to CBH meetings and actions because I like what they stand for. I have family in public housing. I have family who work for public housing. My argument with Intro 48 is not only that I'll get out of the shelter and get back into a home, and the seniors in the city who are living on fixed incomes will be able to have low income housing that they can actually afford. But my argument's been, since I came to PTH, is that all of these properties that are offline are taking money out of the taxpayers. You've heard the city, the state, and the federal government all say the same thing. We don't have the money. Well, you're warehousing property so the developer can come along, build a co-op or a condo that nobody's going to buy, and let that sit there until you get tired of looking at that. Intro 48 and getting the properties back online would help Mo and Eric, because that would put money back into the federal budget. It would help the state budgets. Right to the City is into community land trust, which is something that we would like to incorporate into Intro 48 to make sure the property does stay affordable, and if somebody can't come along 5 years from now, buy it and turn it into another Donald Trump. So, as Mo said, coalitions, you can have different individual ideologies, but you come together for a common good. Last year, we were asked to have someone sit on the panel for Habitat for Humanity, and our lead organizer, Sam, looked at me and sent me off on my merry way. And I went to speak about Intro 48, and Mrs. Henry, another colleague of mine, and myself, we stayed. And we went back to the last class. It was called the School of Faith, Action, and Impact. Well, by the time the school was over in November, we had impressed Josh Lockwood, who is the executive director of Habitat for Humanity here in New York, and his staff, Paige Bellenbaum and Matt Dunbar, where they proposed Intro 48 to the legislative, to be added to the legislative agenda, and the board voted for it. So technically, Intro 48 is no longer just a city bill, but is now on Habitat for Humanity's legislative agenda in Albany. Now, I know Habitat for Humanity. I know Jimmy Carter, they go build houses and put people in housing. But I wouldn't have thought that an organization like that would look at an organization like mine and the bill we put together and see some value in it. Well, we just went to Albany with them on Tuesday to fight for the vacancy decontrol repeal and to strengthening regulations back to what they were 10 years ago. And sitting into a meeting with Hakeem Jeffries with Josh, I realized that if we get Intra 48 passed and we get the properties, that dollar that they would pay somebody else, they could pay, take some of these properties, renovate them, and we have housing faster. So I just brought it up to show that you have some organization like Habitat working with a homeless organization, and you really think the two of them would find common ground together.
I'll be brief. In my view, the purpose of coalitions is collective action, and that can be collective action to oppose something or collective action to move something forward. It's not enough, and I rely on coalitions, particularly because I don't do organizing. I have to get access to the base through other organizations who do. But it's not enough to know whether members of a coalition are against something, whether there are some that are for, whether there are some who are undecided. The question I need to ask, and I'd love an answer to, is where is the collective discussion and debate to come forward with a collective position? Thank you.
Rob?
I'm going to approach this in a way that's probably going to be on shaky ground for some folks, but I think one thing we have to bring into this conversation and dialogue about coalitions and alliances is resources. And, you know, there's a certain amount of foundation money that folks reach out for to do the work that they do, and then that becomes competitive. So it makes it difficult a lot of times to work together, and that's being real, right? You know, let's face it, if we're all doing the same type of work, and there's this one pot of money, and we all got our hands in the pot, somebody's hand ain't big enough to get, you know, enough of those bills to get out of there and do any work. And that causes dissension and tension. And I think, you know, a lot of times there are large groups and national alliances that have a set of goals and objectives that look perfect, but they look perfect to the funder, okay? And whether those are applied on the ground and whether those resources reach the folks that they need to work to do the work that they need to do is different. I can tell you from Take Back the Land, we struggled with partnering up with a large national alliance that I was once a part of, and I don't want to bring up an argument in here, but I had to really get forceful, and I think Monica, that was some of Monica's early on learning from me when I said, look, folks, we need to cut this, you're wasting your time, because that group is not down with what we're doing. You know, so political thinking and all of that stuff comes into play. It becomes a challenge, and that's being real. That being said, it doesn't mean you can't sit down, like Eric said, and say, you know, I'm trying to get here. Can you help me get there? Those conversations should take place and need to take place. I can tell you from the campaign's point of view, we struggle a lot with what some of these national alliances and coalitions considered bringing you into spaces and having consultations. We struggle so much with it, we came up with the word non-sultation, because for the most part, that's what those things were that those folks put together. You didn't have a voice in those places. You got to sit at the table, but you just sit your ass here and don't say anything, all right? Because we got this. Well, that's not how it works. That's not the way the Campaign to Restore National Housing Rights and its groups work. So it's a troubling area to work in. It's not easy to join coalitions. We have started as a campaign a national phone call to try to understand how to make some of this stuff happen and let people have a space where they can dialogue and figure out how we can work together. It's slow getting off the ground, but it is working. Folks are coming up with ideas. And the biggest idea is education. We learned that the landscape is not level. You know, there are some folks that are up here with education, and there are some folks that are down here. And we need to level that playing field. So that's all, those are all ways you have to think, and those are things you have to apply. It's a challenge trying to work with alliances and coalitions, and I can't say it any other way.